or more of students. So these are just the steps on to register. I'm not going to go over them because we will be demoing here shortly. So you'll get a chance to actually watch me navigate, but this is just here for your own reference purposes. And again, this information is all in the Interim User's Manual. One thing to keep in mind is when you are registering students, we do get this question from time to time. The system, as you're manually registering a student, basically initially all you're putting in is a PEIMS ID, saying I need to register this PEIMS ID. And if the system identifies that PEIMS ID because a student has a prior testing history or they're already registered in some other district, it's going to alert you with a pop-up and just identify if it's a match has been found because we have a history on that student, identify who that student is. And it's just basically click yes, continue, and confirm if that in fact is your student. If you identified that the PEIMS ID you entered and the name and date of birth don't match, and you're just not quite sure because you're pretty confident that you have the correct information for your student, reach out to the Tech Assessment Support Center so we can just verify that there isn't someone else that has been tested in historically using an incorrect PEIMS ID, which does happen. So if you're not, if you're confident it's your student and the information matches, and even if it doesn't match, but you're confident it's your student, it's just been an error in the student's name, or the student's had a name change since the last time they tested, go ahead and click yes, continue, and then you can update that information when you're registering the student for the current administration. The other message you may see is a student's already registered somewhere else. If that's the case, you're going to see this message on the right here saying warning, student already registered. Again, if you're positive it's your student, you're just going to go ahead and transfer the student. You want to move this student into your district. There may be we know there's quite a bit of mobility throughout the state. We'll probably see quite a bit more this year, in particular with everything going on. So, again, if you're confident it's your student, go ahead and transfer that student into your district, and go ahead and move forward and proceed with the registration from there. So again, this is just more information on how to register the student manually. Again, I'm not going to go into the details because we're going to go ahead and take a look at the system right now. This is what the page will look like. This is at least where you're entering your test information. But I'm going to go through in detail as we demo here and take a look at the system itself. So let me give me a second to pull up the system. And we are going to register. So we're going to go to the Students tab and register. So this is the manual approach which I was mentioning, where you can register students one by one in the system. And then I mentioned that there's also the ability to register a group of students at one time via an upload file. So that would be the second approach, or this option here, which we'll also take a look at a little bit later in the webinar. We're going to start off with the register approach here, or the manual registration. And as always, the first thing you need to do when you're registering a student is identify which specific administration you actually are registering that student for. You will see in the system that for the 2021 interims, the interim administrations are clearly identified with that prefix INT, trying to not confuse with the summative administrations, which will not have that same designation. So at this current time, you will see these options available to you for the interim, even though registration hasn't technically opened up for interim opportunity 2. You will see these options available to you, which is the spring, which corresponds to what we say is opportunity 2, and then fall for opportunity 1, because that is necessary whenever you're setting up rosters and you want to actually set up rosters for access to the ORS for your teachers and apply those rosters to both administrations at the same time. So you'll see both, but just realize that the opportunity 2 will not be opening up for registration until that November timeframe. So I'm going to go ahead and do a registration for the math and reading opportunity 1. So that's the only 2 subjects being offered for opportunity 1 this year. And go ahead and input my PEIMS ID. We'll just go ahead and use this one. And I'm going to add a student. So we can see in this situation that all the students' information is blank. That's because this is a first-time registration. The student has no history. As we mentioned earlier, you would get a pop-up if the student had been found somewhere else or was registered somewhere else. If they had been registered somewhere else, or we had some testing history and had their information already in the system somewhere, all of this information would already be populated. And in that case, if something had changed, let's say the student's name had changed, you have the ability at this point in time to overwrite that information with whatever is correct. The only piece of information that can't be changed or overwritten is the PEIMS ID itself. That is a locked field. If you identified, like I said, that the PEIMS ID, either for your student or historically it's been used for another student, is incorrect, contact the Texas Assessment Support Center and they can work with you and any other districts that they need to be worked with to kind of figure out where that error is and how to fix it. In this case, we're just going to give our student a name here, webinar training. Local student ID is optional. You don't need to include that, but you're more than welcome. Obviously, all students need to have a birthday in there. I'm just going to randomly pick one for this purpose. And then you are selecting the grade level, and this corresponds to the enrolled grade level. Okay. Well, later on, I'll show you where you could select how to pick a test that's off grade level. But for the purpose of registering the student at this point in time, when we reference grade, that is the student's enrolled grade level. So for this purpose, we're going to register a 5th grade student. You will select their home campus. And this again is where the student scores should be reported back to. In the case for interim, that's going to be the online reporting suite. And in this case, we're going to say that this student is at our elementary school. And then you have the demographic information. Again, all of this would be pre-populated with whatever information we had the student been registered somewhere else or already been in the system as a previous tester. But in this case, it's all blank. Now, for interim assessments, you do not need to input your demographics. Some districts out there have identified that they choose not to for interims. The reason being that when your teachers or others have access to the online reporting suite, there is some functionality that allows you to disaggregate data based on the demographic variables that you've input into the system. And in some cases, the districts have determined that they don't want their teachers to kind of have that level of ability. So if you have any concerns about that, you do not need to input your demographics for a student for the interims. Obviously, for summative tests, that is different because these demographics impact accountability and other factors. So, but for interim, if you would like to leave it blank, that is your option. And in this sake, just for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and leave it blank. And then after we finish the demographic information, it takes us to the second step, which is entering in the test information for the student, okay? Now, the first piece is going to be identifying a particular test. So I want to register a student for the math test. The student is going to be testing at grade 5. And I can see here that the version and mode is locked and the registration type is locked. So the mode refers to obviously paper online. The interim assessments are designed to be online tests, so that is locked down. And the registration type refers to either regular, which just means they're testing within your district, or out of school, out of district, which only really applies for this year to the EOC administrations for summative. So again, those choices, which you could switch if this was a summative assessment for interim, are locked. Testing campus, again, we mentioned earlier that there's a difference between the home campus, which again, I can identify that what I select on the previous screen, and the testing campus. Now, the testing campus automatically will default to whatever I identified the home campus to be. But should there be a situation where I have a student who's not actually going to take the test at their home campus, they're going to take it at another campus in the district, you can identify that other district. So in this case, I'm going to say this student's going to be testing at the alternative campus. And then I can go ahead and identify that at this point in time. What that will do, if you identify a different campus, is the staff who have access to their alternative campus data within the assessment management system will actually be able to locate that student's test ticket and go ahead and download it and pull that student's login credentials so that they can give them that information. So that's really all that the testing canvas does. You will see every campus in your district appears here. For students who will be testing at home, just leave it as the home campus. You don't need to change the testing campus, worry about any of that. If they're going to be testing at home and that's your intent, just keep it at the default setting and leave the testing campus as the home campus. So if any online testing groups have been set up, they would appear in this drop-down menu. So I can see for District Alt Campus, which I set up, they don't have any groups. The default group name is always going to be no group name given. What groups do is basically they group your students that you stick or test that you put into a particular group, and you can name them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, into groups so that whenever you're printing off your test tickets, you can print off a group of students at a time and have a roster that specifically identifies the students that have been tested, that have been placed in that group. So it's just more of a convenience factor. It's not required to include. You can leave it as no group name given. But if you do have quite a bit of students testing and you want to kind of facilitate the process of distributing out those test tickets and not having to cull through just one big stack of them that are all labeled under the same no group name given group, and actually distribute or break them apart and print them off in batches by teacher or whatever other conditions or criteria you'd like, you do have that ability. If I kept it and had my elementary school, I'll see that now I can see all the groups that have already been created for that elementary school. So I could go ahead and if I've already got the group that I want to place the students registration into, I can go ahead and select it at this time. So that's kind of how those operate. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about online testing groups later. And then obviously for grades 3 through 5, you're going to want to determine if it's an English or Spanish test that that student should be taking. And then below that, you have your various PNP options that are available for that particular test. So the options that are displayed as far as your embedded supports or your PNPs are going to correspond to whichever test you have selected up here. So in this case, we're going to go and just say this is a Spanish test, and this student needs a combination of text, speech, and content and language supports. So now we've set up that registration. If the student's also going to take a reading test, I would just click on the add another button and follow the same process. And again, I've got, various tests here. Maybe in this particular test, the student, I got to pick grade level. This particular student is going to test in English and just needs text to speak. Again, these settings are up to you and what is needed by the student. And so let's move on. So once you've completed that process, is obviously there are no more tests to add, except for, I'll throw this out, we talked about testing off grade